Let's do the Moldovan elections. So, in Moldova, there is two big elections that just happened. Well, it's one big election, but two big parts of the election I have to look at. And that is, of course, the race for the country's leadership, which was closer, even if it's not tremendously that close, but was closer than expected, and a referendum on European Union membership. So, for the presidency, Moldova's president, they are ruled by a woman who is not beloved, Sandu, not beloved by the Russians. I'm trying to get a picture of her up quickly. Here she is. She's not loved by the Russians because she's generally pro-European Union. She's generally pro-European integration. She has been constantly calling out Russian interference in Moldovan politics. And while there's a few reports that have been spread around recently, most notably by NPR, which is largely pointing at government accusations from officials within the ruling party, which I think, while, you know, that's giving some highlighting, that's good. I do want to just tell you guys that Russian interference in Moldovan politics runs much deeper. Within the last few years, just to tell you what's happened within the last few years, there have been duffel bags and duffel bags of money given to Moldovan politicians directly by Russian agents found in the homes of elected MPs serving in the Moldovan parliament. Would be the equivalent of an American congressman being found to have had $500,000 in a duffel bag under his bed from a Brazilian politician for any number of tariff reasons or government control reasons or buying of loyalty. Or, for example, a senator from New Jersey taking gold bars from the Egyptians. Anyway, point is, that type of interference, the buying off of politicians, is already known. But Sandu has been saying for the last few weeks that the Russians have been ramping up interference efforts in Moldova's elections, that they're trying to support pro-Russian opposition candidates, and the main opponent to Sandu, who ended up getting 23% of the vote in the election. Sandu ended up getting 42%, so she beat him, but she didn't cross 50%, which was lower than people expected, and it means that they're going to go off into a runoff election. And if the opposition candidate gets endorsed by the other parties, then some people are talking about this possibly actually being much closer than people originally thought. Now, to be clear, it's still likely that she comes out on top in the second round, considering the huge gap that this opposition candidate needs to make up, and considering that it would take quite a lot of the opposition to all line up with the Russian-aligned, pro-Russian candidate. And I'm just saying Russian-aligned because I don't want to get too involved in the domestic affairs of Moldova, like naming like every single coalition bloc. But it would take all of them getting behind them, so it's still not extremely likely. But the fact is that she underperformed, and these reports of Russian influence are still rampant. One example I wanted to show you that she has highlighted and others have highlighted is an accusation that the Russians attempted to buy over 300,000 votes by going to directly pay people, as in giving them money, as in, here's money, vote this way, not as in like, hey, we're going to give you a cookie at this event, or we're going to give you some grain that you could get as a gift, but no, just straight up money for voting against EU integration. Let me show you this clip of an election monitor. So this is what you would call a poll watcher, watching and talking to people as they're leaving the booths about being paid by the Russians. Will you tell me how much they were supposed to pay? 1,000 rubles. For voting, right? Yes. Who promised that? A man, he left. He said he'd be back. But he still hasn't come. Who did you have to vote for? I don't want to say. What did he say exactly? How were you meant to vote in the referendum? They said they paid 500 rubles, then here the man said 1,000. You came from Transnistria. Yes. Are there many of you who came here for the money? Me and her, and then 3 other people meant to come. How are you meant to vote, or just take part? We voted for who they told us. I don't want to say who for. For the EU, was it a yes or a no? That's my business. I won't say. Okay, so Look, I'm sure more evidence or more, footage and more testimony is going to come out in the weeks following this as the government tries to investigate exactly where the money was coming from, exactly who was paid. They start talking to people case by case. Oh, an interesting thing to say here is this woman said she's from Transnistria. For those of you who don't know, Transnistria is this tiny little breakaway region from Moldova that broke off in part because the Russians sent troops into Moldova to fight with Russian speakers in Moldova to then push off the Moldovan armed forces and create this breakaway state that's recognized by basically no one in the world but the Russians. It's also a major network and centerpiece for drug trafficking in Europe, but that's a secondary point. And I just interesting thing to note. That's also why many people are scared that, me included, if the Russians were successful in Ukraine, another location that they could follow up on would be Moldova, where they already have troops, technically, just by international law standards, illegally stationed in Moldova, protecting Russian speakers in Moldova, while making claims to previous Soviet clay, which Moldova certainly lays within. And they are outside of NATO protections and the European Union protections that other European post-Soviet states are able to protect themselves with in the modern day. Anyway, it might be part of the reason why the Russians are getting so involved in Moldova is because they know that their odds of being able to push further than in other states is much higher. Now, if you wanted to read more about this, other networks have written about this before. For example, NPR and other outlets about proposed Russian interference in the election. But I wanted to show you guys that even with all of the claims of Russian interference, with the known Russian domestic interference in Moldovan affairs, and now the alleged vote buying of the Russians, the Moldovans still voted in favor of EU membership. Now, it was much closer than people originally projected it was going to be, just like the presidential race was much closer than anyone predicted it was going to be, with it only being divided by a single percentage point. In fact, as the results were coming in, there were multiple times throughout the night, as it was over the 90% vote tally, that means over 90% of the votes had been counted, there were multiple times where the against EU membership was ahead of the in favor by either a percentage point or half a percentage point. But by the end of the night, after all the votes were counted, the Moldovans voted by 50.46% in favor of joining the European Union and 49.54% against joining the European Union, with basically roughly a 1 point difference. So by a single point, they voted in favor. But it was a real nail biter throughout the night. This was not received very positively in Russia. This was received positively by the Moldovan government because right now they can't really jump around and be really happy about the presidential results because they wanted this to be done in the first round, and now it isn't done in the first round, so they need something to wave around as a victory. And this has been reacted to positively by much of the pro-European Union integration parties in Europe, that those who want to see the EU continue to expand. But it's also very anxiety inducing because look how close this was. This was extremely thin. And while you could say that you have a mandate for EU integration, people will also remember how close that vote was. And there are still continued anxieties and real worries about the amount of Russian interference in the Moldovan elections. Because if this is an example of the Russians making the race this close, I mean, one more percentage point and they could have knocked off the election results if they're legitimately successfully buying many of the votes that are being alleged. Presidential race, pro-EU candidate hasn't been certified as the winner. They're going to have a runoff race, so you're going to have to keep out an eye for that. But they did vote in favor of EU integration despite accusations of Russian election interference. Which, I mean, out of all the countries in the world that the Russians would interfere with electorally, Moldova is the most obvious case. Their interests line up perfectly. They have a previous track record of doing this. This type of clientelism of just like paying people this way is something that was practiced not only in Ukraine as an example of how people like bought votes, but also in other post-Soviet states. It's a very easy way to buy influence And if you don't have strong election monitoring systems, and if you don't have strong civil institutions that can check that, it's going to be much harder to regulate, much harder to stop, even if you document it. Because, like, let's say that even if they find, let's say that they did steal the election. Let's say that they bought all these votes and they stole the election, and then they told everybody, hey guys, I know it just says that we lost this race, but actually we would have won it if it wasn't for the Russians, so we're going to have to do a redo. Even if that happens and you're able to prove it and the civil institution comes in and tries to stop it, if it gets that far, it's going to degrade social trust in these institutions. People are going to say, I thought my vote mattered, but then one thing won, and the TV said it won, and the news people said it won, and then the next day we found out it didn't because the Russians interfered or something. I thought my vote mattered. Can they just throw out the results whenever? What's real? What isn't the real result? And then you start to degrade trust in institutions, break down the relationship with the state, and degrade the ability for the Moldovans to, the Moldovan government to have a productive relationship with their people. EU should start paying people even more? What does that mean? Paying people even more for what?